The sound of my own children plotting my downfall through a baby monitor will haunt me until my dying day. There I was, sitting in my favorite leather recliner, the one Sarah picked out 20 years ago at that furniture store on 8 Mile Road, the same chair where I'd held each of my babies during those sleepless nights when colic made them cry for hours, when I heard voices drifting from the guest bedroom upstairs. At first, I thought maybe I'd left the television on, perhaps one of those afternoon talk shows Sarah used to watch religiously, but then I recognized my daughter's voice, sharp and calculated like her mother's when she was discussing the household budget or planning one of her famous dinner parties. "Dad's getting worse," she said, and my blood ran cold in my veins like ice water flowing through my arteries. The coffee mug I'd been holding, my favorite Detroit Lions mug that my grandson had given me for Father's Day 3 years ago, nearly slipped from my suddenly trembling fingers. "We can't wait much longer. I've already spoken to Dr. Martinez about the evaluation process. He says these things can move quickly once we have the proper documentation." The baby monitor, that damn digital device I bought at Best Buy for my grandson's visits, the one with the crystal clear audio that I'd forgotten to turn off after little Marcus Jr. had stayed over last weekend, was broadcasting every treacherous word directly into my living room with high-definition clarity. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Stay with me until the end of this story and tell me in the comments which city you're watching from, so I'll know how far my words are reaching. Thank you. Hello, my name is Marcus Washington, and I'm 67 years old. I built my life with these two callous hands, raised 4 children after my beloved wife Sarah got sick with the cancer that would eventually take her from us, and worked every single day since I was 14 years old, starting as a bag boy at the old A&P grocery store on Grand River Avenue to give my family everything they needed and most of what they wanted. I never imagined that the greatest betrayal of my life would come from the very people I sacrificed everything for, the 4 human beings I loved more than my own life. But sometimes, the people closest to you are the ones who can hurt you the deepest, and sometimes, an old baby monitor can save your life by revealing truths you never wanted to know. I sat frozen in that chair, my coffee growing cold in my trembling hands, as my eldest daughter continued speaking in that clinical tone she'd learned during her nursing school years at Wayne State University. The same daughter who used to climb into my lap every evening after dinner, begging me to read her just one more story from her favorite book about the little rabbit who was afraid of the dark. Now she was discussing my future with the emotional detachment of a coroner examining a corpse. "The house alone is worth $400,000, maybe more with this crazy market we're in," she said, and I could hear the rustling of papers, probably real estate listings or bank statements she'd somehow gotten her hands on. "Plus his savings accounts, the business accounts from the 3 laundromat locations, his retirement funds, the life insurance policy, we're looking at close to 7 figures when everything's liquidated and properly managed." 7 figures. They were talking about my life's work, my blood, sweat, and tears, like I was already dead and buried in Woodlawn Cemetery next to Sarah, like I was nothing more than a financial portfolio to be optimized by some Wall Street banker. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought it might give out right there in that leather chair, which would have made their job easier, wouldn't it? They could have called it natural causes, told everyone that poor old Marcus just couldn't handle life without his beloved Sarah, and divided up my assets without all this elaborate scheming. But no, I was still breathing, still thinking, still very much alive and aware of every word they were saying about me. My son's voice joined the conversation, deeper and more authoritative than mine had ever been, carrying that confident tone he developed since becoming a doctor at Henry Ford Hospital. The same son whose medical school tuition I'd paid for by working double shifts at the Ford Rouge plant and picking up weekend security jobs at the Southland Mall. I remembered those exhausting years when I'd come home at midnight, my body aching from 16-hour workdays, only to find him at the kitchen table studying for his MCAT exam. I'd sit with him sometimes, bringing him coffee and encouragement, proud beyond words that my boy was going to be a doctor. "I've researched several facilities in the metro Detroit area," he said, and I could hear papers rustling again. "There's one in Southfield that specializes in memory care and dementia patients. It's not fancy, no private rooms, basic cafeteria food, limited visiting hours, but it's affordable. The monthly cost would leave significantly more of the estate intact for distribution. Estate. They were already calling it an estate, like I was some deceased millionaire instead of their living, breathing father who tucked them into bed every single night after their mother got too sick and weak to climb the stairs to their bedrooms. The word distribution hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just planning to warehouse me in some depressing facility. They were already dividing up my possessions like vultures picking over roadkill. I thought about all the precious items in this house: Sarah's wedding ring that I kept in my jewelry box, the antique pocket watch my grandfather had given me when I turned 18, the family photos documenting 50 years of birthdays, graduations, and holidays. Were they planning to sell everything, or would they at least have the decency to keep some mementos of the family we built together? How long do you think we have? This was my youngest daughter, my baby girl, the one I'd carried on my shoulders through the Detroit Zoo when she was 5 years old, pointing out elephants and lions while she squealed with delight. Her voice carried an urgency that made my stomach turn and my coffee taste bitter in my mouth. I mean, before he gets suspicious about what we're doing, or before he really loses it completely and becomes impossible to manage. Loses it completely. As if I was some rabid animal that needed to be caged before I became dangerous to society. I'd raised this child, taught her to ride a bicycle in the empty parking lot behind the old Kmart on 8 Mile, walked her down the aisle at her wedding just 3 years ago, while tears of pride streamed down my face. My middle son, the one who'd always been the quiet strategist of the family, the chess player who thought 5 moves ahead, spoke up with a suggestion that nearly stopped my heart altogether, and made me grip the arms of my chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. "What if we speed up the entire process?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, like he was sharing some dark secret. "I know someone who works in elder law, met him at a medical conference last year. For the right price, we could get a psychological evaluation that shows he's mentally incompetent to make his own decisions. Once we have that legal document, everything else falls into place like dominoes." The casual way he discussed manipulating the legal system to steal my independence made my vision blur with rage and disbelief. This was the boy I'd taught to throw a perfect spiral football in Belle Isle Park on Sunday afternoons, the teenager I'd bailed out of the Wayne County Jail when he got caught with marijuana during his rebellious college years, the young man whose first apartment deposit I'd covered when he couldn't make ends meet as a medical resident. I'd been so proud when he specialized in cardiology, telling everyone at the barber shop and the laundromat how my son was saving people's hearts. Now he was planning to break mine. But it was my eldest daughter who delivered the killing blow to whatever remained of my faith in my children, the final nail in the coffin of my belief that I'd raised decent human beings. "I've already made copies of his signature from old documents I found in his filing cabinet," she said, her voice steady and professional, like she was discussing a routine medical procedure with her nursing colleagues. "Insurance forms, bank paperwork, tax documents, mortgage refinancing papers. I have enough samples to replicate it perfectly with practice. If we need to expedite any paperwork before the official psychological evaluation, I can handle that part of the operation." Forgery. My own daughter, a registered nurse who'd taken the Nightingale oath to do no harm, was planning to commit multiple felonies to steal from her own father. The daughter who'd called me crying when she failed her first nursing exam, the one I'd driven to the university at midnight to pick up when her car broke down, the one whose student loans I'd co-signed when the bank said her credit wasn't good enough. She was talking about forging my signature like it was as natural as taking someone's blood pressure or administering medication. The baby monitor crackled with static for a moment, and I found myself hoping desperately that it would cut out completely, that the technology would fail and spare me from hearing any more of this nightmare unfolding in real time. But modern electronics are cruelly efficient, and the voices returned clearer than ever, discussing the logistics of my destruction with the cold efficiency of a corporate boardroom planning a hostile takeover. They talked about which bank accounts to empty first. Apparently they'd been studying my financial statements for months, maybe years. They discussed how to handle the deed transfer for the house, what story to tell the neighbors about my sudden decline in mental health, and even what personal items they'd keep as mementos, before selling everything else at estate sales and online auctions. My life, reduced to a liquidation plan. Remember, we have to be completely united on this story. My daughter continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when managing her nursing staff at the hospital. If anyone asks neighbors, friends from church, people at the senior center, Dad's been showing clear signs of confusion and memory loss for months. We're all desperately worried about his safety, his ability to manage his finances responsibly, his tendency to wander around the neighborhood at odd hours talking to himself. Wandering around the neighborhood. Every evening after dinner, when the Detroit summer heat finally broke and the air became breathable, I took the same walk I'd been taking for 20 years. Past the community center where I'd coached their little league teams and taught them how to slide into home plate without getting hurt. Past Elmwood Cemetery where we'd buried their mother after her brave fight against breast cancer. Past the old church where we'd been married 35 years ago in a ceremony that cost me 3 months' salary but was worth every penny to see Sarah in that beautiful white dress. It was my way of staying connected to the memories that kept me sane, my daily pilgrimage through a neighborhood that held the entire history of our family. The route took me past the house where we'd lived when the children were small, the playground where I'd pushed them on swings and caught them at the bottom of the slide, the ice cream truck stop where I'd bought them treats every Friday if they'd been good all week. Now they were turning my grief ritual, my way of processing the loneliness that came with losing the love of my life, into evidence of mental decline and dangerous behavior. The conspiracy grew more detailed and more heartbreaking with every word that crackled through that baby monitor. They'd been planning this betrayal for months, maybe even longer. Every concerned phone call asking about my health, every unexpected visit where they claimed to be just checking in, every casual question about my finances or my plans for the future, it had all been reconnaissance for this moment, intelligence gathering for their campaign to destroy my independence. My son mentioned how he'd been subtly testing my memory during our traditional Sunday dinners at Golden Corral, asking me to repeat stories I'd already told earlier in the conversation, then acting deeply concerned when I couldn't remember the exact details or when I told the same anecdote twice. Those dinners I'd looked forward to all week, the only time I got to see my children and grandchildren together, had been turned into psychological evaluations conducted by my own son. My daughters had been conducting inventory surveys of my house during their visits, cataloging valuable items under the pretense of helping me organize and declutter. Now that I was living alone, they'd photographed antiques, jewelry, artwork, and electronics, probably to get appraisals or to plan their division of assets. Every time I'd caught one of them taking pictures, they'd claimed they were just capturing memories or helping me create a photo album of the house for posterity. As I listened to them dissect my life with surgical precision, memories flooded back with painful clarity, each one a sharp contrast to the cold calculation I was hearing through that monitor. I remembered working 3 jobs when they were young days at the Ford Rouge plant building F-150 trucks, evenings doing security at Northland Mall walking empty corridors and watching for shoplifters, weekends running my small laundromat business that started with one rundown location on Corktown and eventually grew into 3 successful locations across Detroit. I remembered those exhausting years when I'd come home at 11 o'clock at night, my work boots caked with mud and my security uniform stained with sweat, only to find homework assignments that needed checking, school forms that required signatures, permission slips for field trips that cost money we barely had. Sarah would have the children bathed and ready for bed, but they'd always wait up for me, lined up on the couch in their pajamas, eager to tell me about their day and show me their schoolwork. I remembered selling my prized 1969 Chevelle SS, a car I'd restored with my own hands over 3 years, working in the garage every weekend, rebuilding the engine, repainting the body that classic rally green color, installing new interior that matched the original factory specifications. That car was my pride and joy, my escape from the pressures of supporting a family. My connection to the dreams I'd had as a young man before responsibility and marriage changed everything. But when my daughter needed money for her wedding and her fiancé's family couldn't contribute their promised share, I sold that beautiful machine without hesitation to pay for the reception hall, the flowers, the photographer, and the honeymoon to Niagara Falls she dreamed about since she was 12 years old. I remembered countless nights sitting by Sarah's hospital bed during her final months, holding her hand while she worried about what would happen to our children if something happened to both of us. She'd made me promise to be strong for them, to guide them through the difficult years ahead, to make sure they stayed close to each other and honored the values we'd tried to instill. "They'll need you more than ever," she'd whispered during one of her good days, when the morphine wasn't clouding her thoughts. "Promise me you'll take care of them, Marcus. Promise me you'll be there for them no matter what. We're doing this for his own good," my youngest said through the monitor, but her voice lacked conviction, like she was trying to convince herself more than the others. Even she didn't believe the lie she was telling herself and her siblings. "He can't live alone forever in this big house. What if he falls down those steep basement stairs? What if he forgets to turn off the gas stove and burns the whole neighborhood down? What if he has a medical emergency and there's nobody there to help him? We're protecting him from himself and protecting innocent people from the damage he might cause. Protecting me from myself. The same man who'd protected them from neighborhood bullies who tried to steal their lunch money, from the poverty that plagued so many families in our Detroit neighborhood, from the harsh realities of growing up poor in a city that was slowly dying around us. The same man who taught them about responsibility, honesty, family loyalty, and the importance of keeping your word no matter what it cost you, virtues they were now discarding like old newspapers blowing down 8 Mile Road. My eldest son's voice cut through my painful reverie with a practical concern that made my blood boil with rage I hadn't felt since the day some punk tried to rob me outside the laundromat 15 years ago. "What about the neighbors? Mrs. Johnson next door has known Dad for 30 years. She's going to ask hard questions if he suddenly disappears into a nursing home without any warning. Same with the people at Mount Olive Baptist Church, he's been going there since before we were born." Mrs. Johnson, who'd been Sarah's best friend and confidant for 3 decades, who still brought me homemade casseroles every Sunday after church, who'd help me while I cried like a baby at my wife's funeral when the reality of my loss finally hit me. Mrs. Johnson, who checked on me during ice storms and heat waves, who collected my mail when I traveled to visit relatives, who still called me honey, and treated me like the son she'd never had. They were already calculating how to handle the social fallout of their betrayal, planning their public relations strategy for when people started asking uncomfortable questions. "We tell everyone the same story," my daughter replied with the chilling efficiency of a crisis management expert. "Dad's been struggling with depression and confusion since Mom died 2 years ago. We've been desperately worried about him for months, but he's been hiding his problems out of masculine pride and stubbornness. The psychological evaluation just confirmed what we already suspected but hoped wasn't true. It's a tragic situation that breaks our hearts, but we're handling it with all the love and care we can manage under these difficult circumstances." Love and care. The words tasted bitter in the air of my living room, even transmitted through the electronic speaker of that baby monitor. Love and care from children who were planning to drug me, kidnap me, and steal everything I'd worked for. Love and care from the people who were supposed to honor my memory, not erase my independence while I was still breathing. I thought about all the sacrifices I'd made for these 4 people who were now plotting to strip away my dignity, my independence, and my life's work with the efficiency of a military operation. I thought about the countless nights I'd gone without dinner so they could have second helpings of whatever modest meals Sarah had prepared on our tight budget. The times I'd worn the same pair of work boots until they had holes in the soles, held together with duct tape and determination, so they could have new school clothes each September. I thought about the dreams I'd deferred and the opportunities I'd passed up because being their father was more important than anything else in my world. The promotion to plant supervisor I turned down because it would have meant too much traveling. The chance to open a 4th laundromat location because the startup costs would have meant less money for their college funds. The vacation to Florida Sarah and I had planned but never took because dental bills and car repairs always seemed to eat up our savings. But as I listened to them casually discuss forging my signature and manipulating medical evaluations, as I heard them planning to drug me into compliance and ship me off to some depressing warehouse for discarded elderly people, I realized I'd failed in the most fundamental way possible. I'd raised 4 financially successful adults who were willing to destroy their own father for money they didn't even need. They all had good jobs, nice houses, new cars, healthy savings accounts, but it wasn't enough. They wanted more, and they were willing to commit crimes against their own blood to get it. I'd taught them everything about survival and success in a harsh world, but nothing about honor, loyalty, or basic human decency. I'd shown them how to work hard and save money, but failed to teach them the difference between earning something and stealing it. The magnitude of that failure hit me like a physical blow, doubling me over in that leather chair while my children continued their clinical discussion of my destruction. The baby monitor continued its merciless broadcast as they moved on to more specific timelines and logistics. The psychological evaluation is scheduled for next Wednesday at 2 o'clock. My son announced with the satisfaction of someone who just closed an important business deal. Dr. Martinez owes me several favors from medical school, and he understands the delicate nature of this situation. He's assured me the paperwork will be processed and filed with the appropriate county offices within 48 hours after the evaluation is completed. 48 hours. In less than 2 weeks, I would go from being Marcus Washington, independent homeowner and business owner, to being Marcus Washington, ward of the state, stripped of my rights and my dignity by the people who owed their very existence to my sacrifices. In 48 hours, strangers would have legal authority over every aspect of my life, where I lived, what I ate, who I could see, when I could leave my room. What if he refuses to cooperate with the evaluation? My youngest daughter asked, and for a brief moment, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe one of them still saw me as their father rather than an obstacle to overcome. What if he gets suspicious and refuses to go, or what if he performs better than expected during the tests? But that hope died quickly when my eldest daughter responded with the same cold efficiency she brought to her nursing duties at the hospital. We've already discussed this contingency with the facility's intake coordinator and Dr. Martinez, she said, like she was reading from a prepared script. They have standard procedures for resistant patients who don't understand what's in their best interest. A mild sedative can be administered at home, presented as medication for anxiety or sleep problems, and then transport can be arranged via a medical van with trained personnel. Sedatives. Medical vans. Resistant patients. They were talking about kidnapping their own father, and they'd already worked out every detail of the operation with medical professionals who were apparently willing to participate in this conspiracy for the right price. The level of premeditation involved in their plan was staggering, and the casual way they discussed drugging me against my will made me realize that I was dealing with complete strangers wearing the faces of my children. The people I'd raised, the babies I'd held, the children I'd taught to ride bicycles and drive cars and balance checkbooks, they were gone, replaced by calculating predators who saw me as nothing more than a financial opportunity. They'd studied my routines, my weaknesses, my trust in them, and weaponized all of it against me. As they continued planning my abduction and imprisonment, discussing backup plans and contingencies like generals preparing for war, I found myself thinking about Sarah and how grateful I was that she wasn't alive to witness this ultimate betrayal of everything we'd tried to build together. She died believing that our children would take care of each other and honor the values we'd tried to instill in them through years of patient teaching and personal example. She'd spent her final weeks worrying about my loneliness, making me promise to lean on our kids for emotional and practical support, to let them help me navigate life without her steady presence and wise counsel. "Don't be too proud to accept their help," she'd whispered during one of our last conversations, when the cancer had stolen most of her strength but not her concern for my welfare. "They love you so much, Marcus. Let them show you that love." If she could see them now, callously discussing my future like I was livestock to be processed, planning to drug and kidnap me for financial gain, it would have broken her heart more completely than the cancer ever could. Sarah had believed in the fundamental goodness of our children right up until her final breath. She would never have imagined them capable of such calculated cruelty. But Sarah wasn't here to see this, and I was alone in my living room, holding a cup of cold coffee with trembling hands and listening to my children plan my destruction through a baby monitor I'd bought to keep their own children safe during overnight visits. The irony was almost laughable. A device meant to protect the most vulnerable members of our family was now revealing that the most vulnerable member was me, and the threat was coming from inside the house I'd mortgaged and remortgaged to pay for their educations, their weddings, their down payments, and their dreams. The house where Sarah and I had made love for the first time as newlyweds, where we'd brought each of our babies home from the hospital, where we'd celebrated every birthday and Christmas and graduation. The house where I'd planned to live out my remaining years, surrounded by memories of the woman I'd loved and the family we'd built together. Now it was going to be sold to strangers who would never know the history contained in these walls, the love and sacrifice and joy that had filled these rooms for decades. As the afternoon shadows grew longer and the voices from the baby monitor continued their relentless planning, I realized that my old life was already over. The Marcus Washington who'd trusted his children implicitly, who'd believed that family bonds were unbreakable, who'd assumed that love and sacrifice would be rewarded with loyalty and respect, that man had died in this chair, listening to his life being dissected by the people he'd loved most in the world. But something new was being born in his place, something harder and colder and infinitely more dangerous than four spoiled adults could possibly imagine. They thought they were dealing with a confused old man who could be easily manipulated and discarded. They had no idea that they just awakened a survivor who'd built everything they were trying to steal, who understood better than they ever would what it meant to fight for what mattered most. The baby monitor crackled with static again, but this time I didn't hope for silence. This time, I leaned forward in my chair and listened more intently than I'd ever listened to anything in my 67 years of life. Because knowledge was power, and I was going to need every advantage I could get in the war my own children had just declared against me. They thought they held all the cards, but they'd forgotten one crucial detail. I'd taught them everything they knew, but not everything I knew. And now, thanks to their own carelessness and a forgotten baby monitor, I knew exactly what they were planning. The question was no longer whether I could stop them. The question was whether they would survive what was coming next. That night, as Detroit slept under a blanket of humid summer air and flickering streetlights, Marcus Washington died in his leather recliner. But what emerged from that chair was something entirely different, a predator who'd been disguised as prey for far too long. The transformation didn't happen all at once like in the movies. It was a slow burn, like the way steel is forged in a furnace, heated and hammered and shaped into something infinitely stronger than the raw material it once was. I sat in that chair until 3 a.m, long after my children had finished their planning session and crept out of my house like thieves in the night, which, I suppose, they were. The baby monitor had gone silent hours ago, but their words continued echoing in my mind with crystalline clarity. Every detail of their conspiracy, every casual cruelty, every calculated betrayal, it was all burned into my memory like a brand on cattle. But instead of breaking me, their plan had given me something I'd lost when Sarah died, a purpose. For 2 years I'd been drifting through my days like a ghost haunting his own life, going through the motions of living without really being alive. I'd wake up each morning hoping the pain of losing her would be less, that the emptiness would fill itself somehow, that my children would need me the way they used to when they were small and I was the center of their world. Now I understood that they did need me. They needed me gone so they could claim their inheritance. They needed me declared incompetent so they could steal everything I'd built. They needed me warehoused in some depressing facility so they could sleep peacefully at night, telling themselves they'd done the right thing for their poor, confused father. Well, they were about to learn that this poor, confused father had been underestimated. The first rule of warfare, and make no mistake, this was war now, is to know your enemy better than they know themselves. My children thought they knew me, but they only knew the version of Marcus Washington who'd prioritized their happiness above everything else, including his own dignity. They'd never met the Marcus Washington who'd survived the mean streets of Detroit in the 1960s, who'd built a business from nothing, who'd outmaneuvered bigger, stronger, richer men to provide for his family. That Marcus Washington had been dormant for decades, buried under layers of fatherhood and responsibility and love. But betrayal has a way of stripping away everything non-essential, revealing the core of who you really are. And at my core, I was a survivor who'd been pretending to be harmless for so long that even I'd forgotten what I was truly capable of. I spent the next 3 days conducting my own reconnaissance, watching my watchers with the patience of a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. I observed their patterns, their schedules, their habits. My eldest daughter visited every Tuesday and Friday, always arriving at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon when she got off her shift at the hospital. She'd bring groceries I didn't need and ask probing questions about my health, my sleep patterns, my ability to manage daily tasks. My doctor's son called every evening at 7 o'clock sharp, right after the local news ended. He'd inquire about my medications, whether I was eating properly, if I'd had any episodes of confusion or disorientation. Each conversation was a diagnostic interview disguised as filial concern, and now I could hear the clinical detachment in his voice that I'd mistaken for professional composure. My youngest daughter stopped by randomly, always with some excuse. She'd been in the neighborhood, she'd had extra food from a restaurant, she'd found something of her mother's that she thought I'd want to see. But her visits always included casual questions about my finances, subtle suggestions that I should consider simplifying my affairs, gentle hints that managing money was becoming too stressful for someone my age. My middle son, the strategist, was the most careful. His contact was limited to Sunday dinners and the occasional phone call, but I realized now that he was coordinating with the others, synthesizing their intelligence reports into a comprehensive assessment of my vulnerabilities. He was the general of this operation, and like all good generals, he kept his distance from the front lines while orchestrating the overall campaign. But they'd made a crucial tactical error. They'd underestimated their target's intelligence-gathering capabilities. That baby monitor wasn't the only electronic device in my house, and I'd learned more about modern technology during my 2 years of loneliness than they could possibly imagine. Sarah used to handle all our technical needs, but after she died, I'd been forced to figure things out for myself. I had security cameras they didn't know about, small, wireless units I'd installed after a break-in attempt 6 months ago. I had voice recording apps on my smartphone that I'd learned to use when my memory started getting a little fuzzy and I needed to remember grocery lists and appointment times. I had online banking access that let me monitor every account transaction in real time. Most importantly, I had time. While they were juggling their jobs, their marriages, their own children, and their conspiracy against me, I had nothing but time to plan, to prepare, and to turn their own weapons against them. They thought my isolation was a weakness, but it was actually my greatest strength. No distractions, no conflicting loyalties, no one to protect except myself. The plan began to take shape like a photograph developing in a darkroom, slowly revealing details that became clearer with each passing hour. If they wanted to play psychological warfare, I'd give them a psychological war they'd never forget. If they wanted to question my mental competence, I'd show them exactly how competent I could be when properly motivated. But first, I needed allies. And the most powerful ally I could have was the legal system they thought they could manipulate. On Thursday morning, I walked into the offices of Henderson, Brooks and Associates, a law firm I'd found through careful internet research, located far enough from my neighborhood that I wouldn't accidentally encounter any of my children's friends or colleagues. I'd chosen this firm specifically because they specialized in elder law and had a reputation for fighting financial abuse cases with the tenacity of pit bulls. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes and a genuine smile, looked up from her computer when I walked in. "Can I help you, sir? I'd like to speak with someone about protecting my assets from family members who may be planning to steal them," I said, watching her expression change from polite interest to sharp attention. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Jennifer Brooks, a sharp-eyed attorney in her 40s who listened to my story with the focus of a surgeon performing delicate operations. I told her everything: the baby monitor, the conspiracy, the planned psychological evaluation, the forged signatures, the timeline for my abduction and institutionalization. "Do you have any proof of these allegations?" she asked, her pen poised over a yellow legal pad. I pulled out my smartphone and played the recordings I'd made of the baby monitor conversations. Her eyebrows rose higher with each damning revelation, and by the time the recordings finished, She was leaning forward with the intensity of a prosecutor who'd just been handed a smoking gun. "Mr. Washington," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "what your children are planning isn't just morally reprehensible, it's criminal conspiracy, attempted fraud, elder abuse, and depending on how far they take it, possibly kidnapping. We're going to stop them, but more importantly, we're going to make sure they face consequences for what they've already done." We spent 2 hours crafting a comprehensive defense strategy. Hidden cameras throughout my house, audio recordings of all interactions with my children, detailed documentation of my mental competence including cognitive tests administered by independent physicians, and most crucially, a complete reorganization of my financial assets that would put them beyond my children's reach regardless of any legal trickery they might attempt. "There's one more thing," Jennifer said as our meeting concluded. "If you really want to teach them a lesson they'll never forget, we can set up a scenario where they think they've succeeded, then pull the rug out from under them at the last possible moment. It's risky, and it requires nerves of steel, but the psychological impact would be significant." I looked into her eyes and saw something that reminded me of Sarah when she was planning one of her elaborate surprise parties, a combination of intelligence, creativity, and barely contained excitement at the prospect of pulling off something spectacular. "Tell me more," I said. The next phase of the plan required acting skills I didn't know I possessed. For the next week, I had to become the confused, declining old man my children expected to see, while simultaneously documenting their escalating manipulation and abuse. It was like living in 2 realities simultaneously: the surface reality where I played the victim, and the hidden reality where I was the hunter stalking my prey. I started small. During my daughter's Tuesday visit, I forgot her name for a few seconds, calling her by her sister's name before correcting myself with an apologetic smile. I asked her to repeat instructions twice, claiming I hadn't heard her properly. I left the stove on after making coffee, giving her the perfect opportunity to express concern about my safety. Her response was both predictable and disgusting. Instead of showing genuine worry, she immediately pulled out her phone and started taking notes, documenting each incident, for what I now knew was a file they were building to support their incompetency claim. She photographed the stove, made voice memos about my confusion, and asked leading questions designed to elicit more evidence of cognitive decline. "Dad, are you sure you're remembering to take your blood pressure medication?" she asked, her voice dripping with false concern. "Maybe we should set up one of those pill organizers to help you keep track." "That might be a good idea," I replied, allowing a note of uncertainty to creep into my voice. "Sometimes I can't remember if I've taken them or not." The lie came easily because I could see her eyes light up with satisfaction. Another piece of evidence for their case, another nail in the coffin of my independence. But what she couldn't see was the tiny recording device Jennifer had given me, hidden in my shirt pocket, capturing every manipulative word. My son's evening phone call that same day followed a similar pattern. When he asked about my day, I mentioned seeing strange cars parked outside my house, implying paranoia and possible hallucinations. When he inquired about my medications, I claimed I'd been having trouble remembering the dosages, even though I'd been managing the same simple regimen for 5 years without any problems. "Maybe it's time to consider some additional help around the house," he suggested, his voice carefully neutral. "Someone who could assist with medication management, meal preparation, general safety oversight." "You mean like a nurse?" I asked, injecting just the right amount of anxiety into my voice. "More like a companion or aide," he said smoothly. "Someone to provide peace of mind for all of us." Peace of mind. What he meant was surveillance and control, someone to report my every move and confirm my incompetence for their legal proceedings. But I played along, expressing reluctant interest in the idea while secretly recording every word of his manipulation. The hardest part was maintaining the performance during family interactions while fighting the rage that threatened to explode every time I heard their calculated concern. These were people I'd loved unconditionally, supported financially and emotionally through every crisis, celebrated with during every triumph. Now they were studying me like scientists observing a laboratory animal, looking for signs of weakness they could exploit. But my anger was fuel for the fire of my determination. Every patronizing comment, every false smile, every manipulative question added another log to the blaze that would eventually consume their carefully laid plans. By the end of the second week, they were practically giddy with confidence. My decline was accelerating beyond their most optimistic projections. I'd given them everything they needed to proceed with their timeline, and they were making final preparations for the Wednesday evaluation that would seal my fate. What they didn't know was that I'd been making preparations of my own. On Monday morning, 2 days before their scheduled intervention, I visited 3 different banks and completed the most complex financial transaction of my life. With Jennifer's guidance and the assistance of a team of specialists she'd assembled, I restructured my entire estate in ways that would make their heads spin. The laundromat businesses were transferred to an irrevocable trust with an independent management company, ensuring they'd continue operating and generating income regardless of what happened to me personally. The house was placed in a different trust with specific conditions that would prevent any forced sale or transfer. My liquid assets were moved to accounts they couldn't touch, protected by legal structures more sophisticated than anything their small-town elder law expert could penetrate. But the masterstroke was the charitable foundation I established with Jennifer's help. If my children succeeded in having me declared incompetent, if they managed to institutionalize me against my will, if they thought they could steal my life's work and get away with it, they'd discover that 90% of my wealth had already been donated to organizations dedicated to protecting elderly people from financial abuse. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Their greed would result in funding the very services designed to stop people like them. But even that wasn't enough. I wanted them to experience the full weight of their betrayal, to understand exactly what they'd thrown away in their pursuit of money they didn't need. I wanted them to feel the same shock and devastation I'd felt listening to them plan my destruction through that baby monitor. So I planned a little performance of my own. Tuesday evening, I called each of them individually and expressed growing anxiety about the evaluation scheduled for the next day. I told them I'd been having second thoughts, that maybe I wasn't as confused as I'd been feeling lately, that perhaps I should postpone the appointment until I felt more certain about my mental state. Their responses revealed the depths of their desperation and manipulation. Instead of being relieved that their father might be feeling better, instead of celebrating a potential improvement in my condition, they each worked frantically to convince me that the evaluation was necessary for my own safety and well-being. "Dad, you've been so worried about your memory lately," my daughter said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "This evaluation will either put your mind at ease or help us get you the assistance you need. Either way, it's the right thing to do. You've already taken the hardest step by admitting you need help," my doctor's son added during his call. "Dr. Martinez is expecting you, and postponing now would just delay getting answers to important questions about your health." The irony was breathtaking. They were so invested in proving I was incompetent that they couldn't allow me to demonstrate competence. Their conspiracy had become more important than my actual well-being, and they were willing to gaslight their own father to protect their financial interests. But I had one more surprise waiting for them. Wednesday morning arrived gray and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that makes Detroit summers legendary for their misery. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the navy blue one Sarah had helped me pick out for our daughter's wedding, and made sure every recording device was positioned perfectly. Jennifer and her team were already in position, waiting for my signal to spring the trap we'd spent 2 weeks preparing. At exactly 1:30, 30 minutes before my scheduled appointment with Dr. Martinez, my children arrived at my house for what they believed would be my final ride as a free man. They came together this time, presenting a united front for the last phase of their operation. The sight of them standing on my front porch, dressed in their most respectable clothes and wearing expressions of solemn concern, filled me with a cold fury that threatened to compromise my performance. But I'd come too far to let emotion derail the plan now. I opened the door with a trembling hand and a confused smile, the picture of a frightened old man grateful for his children's support during a difficult time. "Are you ready, Dad?" my eldest daughter asked, her voice gentle and reassuring. "We're all going to be there with you. Dr. Martinez is very understanding, and this whole process will be over before you know it." I suppose so, I replied, allowing uncertainty to color my voice. I just hope I don't embarrass myself. My mind feels so foggy lately. They exchanged glances of barely concealed satisfaction. Everything was proceeding exactly according to their plan, and in less than 2 hours, they'd have the legal documentation necessary to begin liquidating my assets and warehousing me in their chosen facility. The drive to Dr. Martinez's office was a master class in manipulation. They took turns reassuring me, explaining how the evaluation was routine and nothing to worry about, while simultaneously planting suggestions about my incompetence and need for assistance. They reminded me of recent episodes of confusion, emphasized how much they loved me and wanted to help, and painted a picture of the evaluation as a loving intervention rather than a calculated attack on my independence. I played my part perfectly, asking anxious questions about what the doctor would want to know, expressing gratitude for their support, and generally behaving like a man who trusted his children completely, and had no idea they were leading him to his own destruction. But as we pulled into the parking lot of the medical building where Dr. Martinez had his practice, I allowed myself one small smile. Because in exactly 15 minutes my children were going to learn that underestimating Marcus Washington was the most expensive mistake they'd ever made in their lives. The waiting room was sterile and anonymous, filled with the kind of generic furniture and motivational posters that made medical facilities feel like temporary waypoints rather than places where life-changing decisions were made. My children arranged themselves around me protectively, maintaining their performance as concerned family members right up until the moment Dr. Martinez called my name. Mr. Washington? I'm Dr. Martinez. Would you like your family to join us for the initial consultation? This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the culmination of 2 weeks of careful planning and perfect acting. I looked up at the doctor, a thin man in his 50s with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of soft features that suggested he'd spend more time in offices than examining rooms, and smiled the confused, grateful smile of an old man who didn't understand what was happening to him. Yes, please, I said, my voice carrying just the right note of anxiety and dependence. I feel better when they're with me. Sometimes I get confused and forget important things. The examination room was small and cramped, barely large enough for Dr. Martinez's desk, 2 patient chairs, and the 4 additional chairs my children had requested for this family conference. As we settled into our seats, I could feel the anticipation radiating from my offspring like heat from a furnace. They were minutes away from achieving their goal, and their excitement was almost palpable. Dr. Martinez opened a file folder and pulled out several official-looking documents, arranging them on his desk with the precision of a man who'd performed this routine many times before. This was clearly not his first encounter with families seeking to have an elderly relative declared incompetent, and his professional demeanor suggested he was comfortable with the ethical compromises his services required. Now then, Mr. Washington, he began, his voice professionally kind but detached. Your son has explained that you've been experiencing some cognitive difficulties lately. Memory problems, confusion about daily tasks, difficulty managing your finances. Is that an accurate assessment of your situation? I looked around the room at my children's faces, seeing the barely contained eagerness in their eyes as they waited for me to confirm their lies. This was their moment of triumph, the culmination of months of planning and manipulation. They thought they'd already won. They had no idea the game was just beginning. Doctor, I said, my voice suddenly clear and strong, stripped of the confused uncertainty I'd been performing for weeks. Before I answer that question, I think there are some things you should know about why I'm really here. The change in my demeanor was so sudden and complete that the entire room seemed to freeze. My children's expressions shifted from anticipation to confusion to growing alarm as they realized something had gone terribly wrong with their carefully orchestrated plan. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, placing it on Dr. Martinez's desk with the deliberate precision of a poker player laying down a royal flush. What you're about to hear, I continued, my voice now carrying the authority of a man who'd built businesses and raised families and survived everything Detroit could throw at him, are recordings of my children planning to defraud me, steal my assets, and have me illegally committed to a nursing home against my will. I believe the technical term for what they've been attempting is elder abuse, and I have documentation proving every aspect of their conspiracy. The silence in that room was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls, could hear my eldest daughter's sharp intake of breath, could hear my doctor son's pen clattering to the floor as his hands went slack with shock. Dr. Martinez leaned forward, his professional composure cracking like thin ice under pressure. "Mr. Washington, I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything, Doctor. I'm stating facts that will be verified by law enforcement officers who are currently reviewing evidence of attempted fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and your own participation in a scheme to provide false medical evaluations for financial gain." That's when my youngest daughter found her voice high and shrill with panic. "Dad, what are you talking about? We're here because we love you, because we're worried about your health." I turned to look at her, this woman I'd raised from infancy, whose diapers I'd changed and whose tears I'd dried and whose dreams I'd funded, and felt nothing but contempt for the stranger she'd become. 2 weeks ago," I said, my voice cutting through her protests like a blade, "I heard every word of your planning session through the baby monitor you forgot was turned on. I know about the forged signatures, the bribed doctor, the plan to drug me and transport me to a facility against my will. I know about your timeline, your division of my assets, your lies to the neighbors. I know everything." The explosion of voices that followed was like a dam bursting, denials, accusations, desperate attempts to regain control of a narrative that had already escaped their grasp. But I'd heard enough of their lies to last several lifetimes. I stood up, straightening my suit jacket with the dignity of a man who'd just reclaimed his life, and looked down at the 4 people who'd given birth to but no longer recognized as my children. "You wanted Marcus Washington declared incompetent," I said, my voice carrying the weight of absolute finality. "Congratulations. You've succeeded beyond your wildest dreams. I'm completely incompetent when it comes to trusting people who would betray their own father for money. But fortunately for me, I'm still quite competent when it comes to protecting myself from thieves and predators even when they share my DNA. The war was over before they'd even realized it had begun. And Marcus Washington, the real Marcus Washington, not the confused old man they'd been trying to create, had won." The aftermath of that Wednesday afternoon played out like dominoes falling in slow motion, each consequence triggering the next in a cascade of justice I'd orchestrated but never fully imagined would be so thoroughly satisfying. Dr. Martinez lost his medical license within 6 months, his willingness to provide fraudulent evaluations for the right price finally catching up with him when Jennifer's team presented the state medical board with recorded evidence of his corruption. My eldest son faced an ethics review from the hospital where he worked, and while he managed to keep his job, his reputation in Detroit's medical community never recovered from the scandal of trying to have his own father illegally committed. My daughters discovered that being accessories to attempted elder abuse carried social consequences that extended far beyond legal ramifications. Word spread through our neighborhood, our church, their workplaces. Mrs. Johnson, bless her heart, became the unofficial town crier of their disgrace, making sure everyone knew exactly what kind of people would plot against their own father. The same community that had once admired them for being such devoted children now crossed the street to avoid speaking to them. But the most devastating consequence was the one I'd engineered with Jennifer's help, the complete restructuring of my estate that left them with nothing but the knowledge of what they'd thrown away. When they discovered that their greed had resulted in my donating 90% of my wealth to elder abuse prevention organizations, the shock on their faces was worth every penny I'd given away. For 6 months, my house stood empty of family visits, silent of their voices, free of their manipulation. I found a peace in that silence that I hadn't experienced since Sarah died, the peace of a man who no longer had to question the motives of everyone around him. Then, on a snowy December evening just before Christmas, my youngest daughter appeared at my door. No phone call to announce herself, no elaborate excuse for the visit. She stood on my porch in the falling snow, tears freezing on her cheeks, holding nothing but a handwritten letter that began with 2 words I'd wondered if I'd ever hear from any of them again. "I'm sorry. We didn't reconcile that night, or the next week, or even the next month. Trust, once shattered completely, doesn't repair itself quickly or easily. But slowly, painfully, through months of honest conversations and genuine remorse on her part, we began to build something new, not the blind faith I'd once had in her, but something better, a relationship based on mutual respect rather than assumed loyalty. My other 3 children never returned, never apologized, never acknowledged the magnitude of what they'd attempted to steal from me. Last I heard, they'd convinced themselves that I was the villain in this story, that somehow they'd been wronged by my refusal to be victimized. That kind of self-deception is its own punishment, more effective than any legal consequence I could have pursued. Now, 3 years later, I sit in the same leather recliner where this story began, but I'm not the same man who sat here that terrible afternoon listening to his children plot his destruction. That man was naive enough to believe that love and sacrifice automatically earned loyalty and respect. He was weak enough to let others define his worth and his competence. The man I am now understands that respect is earned through strength, not kindness. That sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones you've loved most. That family isn't determined by blood alone, but by the choices we make about how we treat each other. I've learned to be suspicious of excessive concern, to question motives that seem too convenient, to trust my instincts even when they conflict with my hopes. I've learned that being alone isn't the same as being lonely, and that peace of mind is worth more than any amount of money or social approval. Most importantly, I've learned that underestimating someone because of their age, their grief, or their apparent vulnerability is a mistake that can cost you everything you think you deserve. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. I hope my story serves as a reminder that we should never take for granted the people who love us, because betrayal has a way of revealing strength in the betrayed that the betrayer never saw coming. Honor your parents while you still can, because some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. And remember, the quiet ones, the grieving ones, the seemingly helpless ones were often far more dangerous than you could ever imagine when you threaten what we hold dear. In the end, family isn't about blood or obligation. It's about respect, loyalty, and the choice to stand by each other when it matters most. My children forgot that lesson, and it cost them everything. Don't let it cost you the same.